So I start here because one of the things that comes up in my class often is when did flower essence therapy start? And I know that we attribute many of the discoveries and accomplishments to Dr. Edward Bach, who is responsible for bringing flower essence therapy as a formal discipline here in the Western world. And there are so many organizations that have built on Dr. Bach's work and really have allowed us to experience flower essences and make it relevant for today's world and the changing soul hiccups that come up for us. But if we go all the way back, I love this picture from the ancient world, because we see here this person is carrying a bunch of herbs, a bunch of flowers, a bunch of roots and possibly berries. And we don't know, was this an herbal decoction? Was this a bath? Was this an offering for a deity? We really don't know. But when we think about the time that this was taking place, the answer to all of those would be yes. Yes, it's an offering. Yes, it's an herb. Yes, it's a bath. Yes, it's a prayer. And so in African philosophy, we don't separate our medicine from philosophy, from theology, from agriculture, and the other necessities of life. It is an integrated wholeness. And when we say that medicine is applied spirituality, we're hearkening back to a time where how we approach our medicine is a reflection of how we see ourselves as an interconnected part of the cosmos. And so we're going to actually come back to this concept of applied spirituality a bit later. Dr. Covey speaks of the first psychologist, the first to explore what it means to be human in our mind and our psyche. Were also priests, priestesses, spiritual leaders that integrated magic and religion with plant remedies and herbal medicines. Flower essence therapy builds absolutely on that lineage. And so one of the philosophers that I really appreciate as I do this work is a philosopher named Jean Gebser, who is a German philosopher. And his work is a seminal text called The Ever-Present Origin. And in this text, he looks at the consciousness that has shaped humanity from the ancient times to the future. So he uses a survey of art and sacred texts and cultural artifacts and poetry and music, and he looks at the architecture of these different periods of humanity, and he organizes them in these structures, which he labels as the archaic, the magical, the mythical, the mental, and the integral. And he affirms that ancient civilizations did not just have a different way of life, they actually perceived the universe through different faculties. And so what we're going to look at today are some of the faculties that we're using now and how to lean into that magical consciousness, as he labels it. What does that mean, and how do we access it? How do we protect it? How do we use it in our work with flower essences? So he discusses that of each of the consciousness structures, there is one that we would consider emergent, which means that it's coming into consciousness, it's beginning to form, and it's beginning to dominate. And then as a new consciousness structure emerges, then the previous structure becomes deficient or even inefficient. In other words, it doesn't work anymore. And we find chaos in the world as that consciousness structure starts to dissipate and lose its footing. And what he talks about is this emergence that we are moving into of integral consciousness or integrality. And in the integral consciousness structure, we are able to honor all of the other previous states of consciousness that live in our psyche. So we're able to call on the mythical, we're able to call on the magical, or even the archaic. It's a acknowledgement that different learning styles and patient-client processes extend from these structural orientations. So when I'm in my practice, if someone is really leaning towards more of a mental consciousness structure, I'm going to structure their healing process a bit differently than someone that tends to think in movement and music and imagery. And so as part of integral consciousness structure, we can choose how we want to, the lens that we want to use for our understanding of our universe as well as our patients. And then the last part of this is the willingness to access these structures within ourselves as needed. So can I float into my magical? Can I dream into my mythical? Can I get really down to the science of things by using my mental consciousness structure? So he discusses this integral conscious structure as something that is emerging. We see it in the growth of mind-body medicine over the past few decades, the paying more attention to the relationship between our emotions and our spirit and our physical symptoms, and how that is starting to reemerge in the medical psyche. And then what he describes as deficient is our mental consciousness structure. So Gebser would say that we are living in a time that is pretty predominated by the mental consciousness structure, but it's starting to not work out so great for us. We're starting to see the limitations of seeing the world through this very analytical, rational dichotomy of the world. And so the mental consciousness structure peaked during the Age of Enlightenment in Europe, which was a period of time that really exalted this individual perspective. The idea of the Cartesian logic, I think, therefore I am, really comes into prominence during this time, where there is a high value placed on the personal ego, individual perspective, and intellectual discourse. And so Gebser asserts that this consciousness structure is on the decline, that it has served us well, but it's not going to carry us into where the world is going. One of the tenets of the mental consciousness structure is dualism. And dualism, which is part of Cartesian logic, it did not just separate the body from the mind. That's kind of what it's known for, the split between the mind and the body, the ability to experience my mind as separate from my body. But in doing so, it separated humanity from nature, nature from spirit, and by extension, humanity from the spirit of nature. And so as the mental consciousness structure is on the decline, we're invited to remember what it meant for humanity to be intrinsically connected to the spirit that resides in nature. When we see evidence of this separation from nature, this is an image of deforestation in terms of the way that humans have been destroying the planet and destroying nature because of the disconnection from that spirit. So in the psychology of environmental problems, the researchers described the tenets of the mental consciousness structure, which ushered in this idea that nature is composed of inert physical elements. In other words, nature is not alive. It's dead matter that can be and should be controlled by humans, and for the purpose of private economic gain and endless work in progress. And so this really flies directly in opposition to the beliefs that humanity held before then, in which the nature was sacred, in which we were an interconnected part of nature, and that there was this hiddenness of the divine that humanity was moving into, where we started looking for the divine up above and separate from nature, instead of down to the earth and around to one another to see reflections of spirit. So this separation from nature continues, because what we know about the Age of Enlightenment in the European continent is that it was also responsible for colonialism and imperialism around the world. It was responsible for the slavery and the annihilation and the genocide of indigenous people. I have here an image from the Ma'afa, or the African slave trade, and on the right is a picture from that's a depiction of the Berlin Conference, which was a conference to discuss how Africa was going to be divided in order to avoid conflict between European nations. So instead of looking at the continent and the land and the people there as a source of spirit and life and vitality, they looked at the continent and said, okay, there's gold, there's oil, there's cotton. What can we take from this land? and how can we own this land, and how can we control this land and use it to support our power? How can we use the people who live here as labor and do the same thing in the Americas? How can we eliminate the indigenous people who are already living and held that land as sacred in the Americas and turn it into something that is for profit? And so this separation between the earth and the spirit of humanity is not just evidenced in how we interact with our environment, but also how we interact with one another. And so I'm bringing forward a quote by one of my favorite environmental activists who says, "Why is it so easy for people to think like mountains and not to think like people of color?" So as we're moving into a deeper appreciation for the natural world, to remember that that is not separate from the systems of oppression that still exist for many cultures and communities, and that we can work on these two. We can work on this as we start to shift our alignment with the mental consciousness structure that separates us from one another and from the earth. So there is still yet hope, because again, the consciousness is shifting. And as we move out of the mental, which is deficient and declining, though still very prominent, we are emerging with the integral. And what that means is that we have access and invitation to the archaic, the magical, and the mythical. And for those of us who are at this conference because we identify as being sensitive beings, that sensitivity, I believe, is really our superpower. That superpower of being able to call on the mythical and the magical in the world that does not necessarily understand what that is. But as we move closer into integral consciousness, I'm hopeful that our magic and our mythical and our sensitivity will play a greater role in healing the planet and healing one another.